Good evening, folks. So I hate to break up these great conversations happening at the front, but we should get started so that folks can have the full benefit of Dora Epstein Jones's intellect this evening in her presentation here in the public programs, the lecture series of the CCA Architecture Division. I'm Jonathan Massey, Dean of Architecture here, and our main introduction this evening is going to come from visiting faculty member Clark Tenhouse. For those who are just joining us this evening, this is the conclusion of a weekend workshop that started with presentations right here on Friday by Christy Bellier and Andrew Holder, and continued with a weekend full of intense student production under the guidance of those two. And it reflects our use of the lecture series framework, sometimes to bring in solo speakers to talk about what they're doing and the kind of knowledge they're generating about architecture, but also as a framework for faculty initiative. And as you will have noticed if you've come to more of these, sometimes the Digital Craft Lab sponsors a symposium or a speaker. Sometimes the Urban Works Agency organizes events here and in other venues that form part of our public programs. The Experimental History Project kicked off our semester with the Platform Symposium. So this is this evening's closing keynote by Dora Epstein Jones to the Almost Familiar Forms workshop is a continuation of that pattern and a welcome use of this opportunity to kind of share out what faculty are thinking about and doing here and beyond. So with that, Clark Tenhouse.
So thanks, Jonathan, for that. Tonight we're incredibly lucky to have Dora Epstein Jones to sort of tie a bow on it in some ways, but also provoke in many other ways. And so I feel sort of incredibly fortunate to have her here as the sort of closing voice for the events. To read a kind of prepared statement on in her favor, I would say that in contemporary architecture, there are theorists who theorize, critics who critique, authors who write, designers who design, historians who historicize, and intellectuals who intellectualize. But there are few among us who achieve a high level of excellence in all of these capacities. Dora Epstein Jones is one of these people. Dora Epstein Jones is a PhD, a theorist, and a teacher of architectural culture, and is currently the coordinator of general studies at SciArc, where she has taught for over 10 years. Dora earned her master's degree and a doctorate degree in architectural history, theory, and criticism in urban planning from UCLA. And her work mainly focuses on the discipline of architecture and includes interrogations of the discipline's boundaries and operations through examinations of tectonics, practice, pedagogy, as well as generally external concerns such as gender, sex, mobility, and criticality. Dora is a past research fellow of the Luce Foundation in the UC Regents, the Getty Research Institute, and the AIA. Dora has also been a longtime collaborator with Jones Partners Architecture and has often been a member of its exhibition and installation design teams. Dora is widely published and has curated exhibitions at the A&D Museum, SciArc, and local galleries. And Dora recently edited volume 31 of Log entitled New Ancients with Bryony Roberts. If you are interested in purchasing this issue of Log, you may do so for $1,000 on Amazon. This is a screenshot from my computer yesterday morning at 10:31, I think. So this should give you some sense of the kind of import and the gravity of this particular issue, and in particular what Dora has to say on the subject of architecture. Luckily for us, tonight's talk will not cost us $1,000, but Dora's insights, critiques, positions, knowledge, and experience will prove to be invaluable. Please join me in welcoming Dora Epstein Jones to the stage as the closing keynote for the Almost Familiar Forms workshops at the California College of the Arts. Thank you. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you. I've never felt so valuable. I have 5 copies of that if you are interested. I'd love to sell them. So hi, thank you to Jonathan Massey, my, old colleagues who come back together. That's so nice. Amanda Schwerin, who I don't know if she's here, but she's magic. Clark Tenhouse, who has organized and coordinated and brought this thing into life. Christy Ballier, Andrew Holder, the faculty and staff at CCA, the students who were kind of willing to put themselves on the line. The very random and dear appearance of Andrew Atwood, thank you, and the random and also very dear appearance of the network Speed Dome. So with those thank yous out of the way and all of the adoration, why don't I finish all that adoration at this point and start with the bad stuff. So I'd like to start tonight with some more almost familiarity by introducing, or at least reintroducing you to Roberto Mangabeira Unger. Unger is a social theorist, a campaign advisor, a politician. He ran an imaginary campaign in 1990 to see how many votes he could garner among the poorest slums of Rio de Janeiro. And for that, he was nominated and then served as the Deputy of Strategic Affairs for about 10 years under the Lula administration in Brazil, until about 2008. Unger is currently the Roscoe Pound Professor of Law at Harvard. His books are wide-ranging and unrelenting, from political theory to social theory to natural philosophy, but can be summarized along the lines of, 1, that most social and political theory seems to rest on basic concepts. For example, Marx's theory rests on the concept of labor. And 2, that those basic concepts are treated as universal or natural when they are, in fact, neither universal nor natural. His theory of what he calls, quote, false necessity, which is the artifice of most human concepts, is one that he then burdens the individual with. His call is to replace the moral actor of Kantian theory. For Unger, the individual should act first and reflect later, which is potentially very interesting for anyone pursuing a more technique-driven form of experimental work. It's also a great alibi for my 9-year-old son. Unger has been referred to as, quote, slippery in the press. The Guardian called him a very articulate cement mixer and a preposterous romantic. He's described by his students at Harvard as, quote, a pastor at a pulpit, and the New York Times as, quote, suffering from something of a language barrier, end quote, because he refers to, quote, residents of remote jungle outposts as my fellow citizens. In 2008, he sent a lot of text messages supporting his former student Barack Obama, and so he claims that he was an advisor to Barack Obama. And then in 2012, he decided that Obama had doled out too many food stamps and so had to be voted out. So for better or for worse, Unger was the teacher of this guy and this guy. And this guy taught theory to all of these young architects. But much more directly, Unger was also one of the most influential shapers of contemporary architecture. He is paraphrased at length by Jeffrey Kipnis in his seminal text Toward a New Architecture, and it is from Unger that Kipnis outlined the 5 criteria of a transformative, Deleuzian, projective, eventually computer-driven, digital, generative, and speculative new architecture. Here are the 5 criteria from Unger, and then the modifications by Kipnis in 1991. So Unger says vast, and Kipnis changes that to vastness, or sufficient spatial extension to avoid traditional spatial patterns, but not so vast as to be infinite or universal, i.e. not modern. He translates blank to blankness, that is, to free massing to have unexpected formal or semiotic affiliations. He translates architecture needing to have a point into pointing, meaning for Kipnis architecture, the contemporary architecture must be projective, not to be confused with signifying. The incongruous into incongruity, that is for Kipnis to maintain and subvert received data simultaneously rather than trying to maintain harmony and proportion. And then he changes the incoherent to a kind of intensive coherence. With Kipnis, this is probably the most troubled section, that is the properties of monolithic arrangements that have multiple or contradictory relationships. And Kipnis is very careful here to say this is not to be confused with Robert Venturi's concept of the difficult whole. So vastness, blankness, pointing, incongruity, and intensive coherence. And these are my own observations as to how those criteria were developed into architectural design from that time in the intervening 25 years. Masses, meaning mostly monoliths, surfaces, meaning especially the kind of surfaces that were enabled through rendering in Maya, as well as surface textures, interior objects or voids, and the kind of morphology of those interior objects and voids. And then the problem, I think, that was translated a little bit later, which is how then do you move that into a grounded condition and, you know, deal with the ground, whether as a politically charged ground or as the kind of fiction of a ground in various urban architectures throughout the world. And case in point, these are the kinds of monoliths, for example, that are out there now and proliferate. And these are, and pardon the pun, they're kind of just barely scratching the surface of the formal differentiation that has been at play from this toward a new architecture on, as well as their surface articulation, not to mention the interior objects and voids, the interior volumetric displacements, and a thorough rehearsing of the 1,000 myriad possible ground configurations that have accompanied that new architecture over the last 25 years. Okay, so that sets a stage in the discipline that more or less states the sort of where we are now. This is where I am from. And where I'm from, we spend a lot of time here in the barn. That's me. We spend a lot of time there in the barn. That's my niece. She's on Duke. And I'm on a mare named Mare. And we are roping. We're roping, which I don't know if any of you have ever roped, but basically it starts like that. Is there a little pointer on here? Ooh. Starts with a calf in that chute. Then all hell breaks loose because that calf comes out of that chute, and two cowboys or cowgirls, or cowboy and a cowgirl, I guess it doesn't matter, goes chasing them down as the cow is released, and gallop at full speed. You catch it with a lasso. You lasso a rope around its head, that's the header, and then the other one around the rear hooves, which is the heeler. And okay, yeah. The calves aren't hurt by this. It's, although we kill them and eat them after they grow up, so I suppose it's not a great scene, but it takes a lot of space. And it takes place in these, because I come from here, which is Oregon, which is very, very wet, it tends to take place indoors in these arenas. And these arenas are pole buildings. And the one that we were in that picture is a pole or post building, very much like this one that you can buy in a steel or wood frame model, clad to your needs, meaning clad as much as you need it, and given the weather conditions of the place that you're in. So this is how it shakes out kind of as the quote construction drawings from the manufacturer. This one is for a 40 by 72 foot, but you can have a pretty regular pole barn that has a large clear span of about 90 feet run as many as 400 feet if you are calf roping, right? So these get fairly large. If you're using it for dressage, you could go up as much as 500 feet for a dressage arena in it. Most farm outbuildings in the 20th and 21st century in the United States, but also frankly gaining worldwide use, are of this nature. That's the long span bay or truss construction with a very thin galvanized envelope, or in some cases even membrane fabric. If you're a fancy family in Kentucky or Virginia, you can order pretty ornaments and red coating to make this thing look more like an old-fashioned barn with kind of horribly outsized slider doors. But most of us don't bother to impress a neighbor out where I'm from, because they don't actually give a rat's butt about what your barn looks like. And so as I travel back and forth between my kind of rural home and my rural upbringing and my highfalutin urban architectural theory doctorate, it's occurred to me that these buildings are rather contemporary. Contemporary in the sense that they're vast, they're blank, they're pointy, I think, because they're ripe for speculation. They're incongruent in that they kind of maintain this housiness at the scale of, industrialized agriculture. They are incoherent, or, as intensively coherent as Kipnis reminds us, in that they're monolithic. They tend to be very singular, at least from the outside. They also belong to an extensible construction paradigm of high modernism, that is, points and poles usually resting on a concrete slab. So even when you see it, what looks like a kind of dirt floor arena, it's actually still resting on a concrete slab. And as I showed the monoliths earlier, it would seem that we have come to a point in the development of a new architecture that we can move from the same experiment over and over and over again to the discovery and consolidation of the material, spatial, volumetric affects and effects of that contemporary architecture. And while it's often misread, this is the point of Sylvia Lavin's essay in Log 29, in which she looks at some 13 consecutive single surface serpentine pavilions and says, we're bored. And it's not that she's suffering from some kind of existential ennui, it's that she says we're actually in the happy boredom, her words, of a paradigm that has ceased shifting and is now settling in. I don't think that, as the title of her essay says, Lying Fallow, is really just waiting around for someone to seize invention, as she kind of asserts, but rather a very interesting, if not the most interesting, form of boredom, which is the boredom that accompanies careful study, that accompanies really understanding the what over the how. So over the last few months, I've convened a small group of what I call victims, but they're actually just students, and an even smaller group of SciArc faculty to help me think through this kind of little folly of mine. They've happily indulged me, and I'm grateful for that, but this is very much in its beginning process. I believe that they would all acknowledge that my interest in the rural is coming at a time when Rem Koolhaas has declared the rural as the appropriate frontier of the 21st century architecture, and I believe that this is a shared concern among some of my colleagues, Sam Jacob notably, but I'm also seeing grain silos popping up in interesting places in studio work by Alana Manfredini and David Roux and Ferda Colatan, to name a few. So the work that we're doing, we're calling it Undecorated Sheds and Other Rural Types. The undecorated sheds obviously riffing off of Venturi, and then the other rural types, of course, referring to the development of a typology. So I've been, and me and my little group, so I'm going to use the word we, but I don't mean it like Queen Victoria would use the word we, I just mean it like we, this little group that I'm much indebted to, have been looking at rural buildings and typing them In two different directions. So one has to do with a kind of functional or historical typology, meaning the assigning of a indexical association, like, okay, this is a granary, this is a coop, this is a coop of a certain region, this is a granary of a certain region, a silo, so forth, so forth, so forth. And the other axis is the axis of those four main topologies that I discussed before, that is massing, skin, interior objects or voids, and then ground conditions. So here, this is a massing chart of the granaries. This is a kind of massing summary of the granaries that we looked at. And you can see here the different granaries. So in this case, this is a very formal typology, not much a functional typology of these granaries. The gable roof, the slant side, the shed roof, the double, the arch roof, the circular canopy, the tall canopy, the linear, and the circular cluster. And that's matrixed against these types of mass that we're identifying: the single mass, the multiple mass, the large mass, small, lower, taller masses. And then going through and doing the same kind of thing for skins, single walls, double walls, solid skins, slatted skins, and then different material conditions of skins. Interior spaces, single spaces, double spaces, multiple spaces, slotting, horizontal spaces, or horizontal objects, vertical divisions, so forth, in the interior spaces, and then various ground conditions. So meeting the ground on grade, below, raised, elevated, plinth, base, platform, and bed, and the ones that occur to us, we kind of X them out. And so I divided this group of students into a kind of series. They each took on a group of building types, and then we've been kind of playing out this weird Foucauldian exercise of seeing where there are overlaps and where there aren't across many of the different ones. And so this is the granary again, that you're seeing here in a kind of long form of its various manifestations in terms of those topological dimensions of a contemporary architecture. So this is how each one looks. It basically, there's a kind of massing, we turn these into these diagrams where there's a massing, there's an interior division or object, there's a skin, and then there's a ground. So we did chicken coops. These are box coops with chicken runs. Folded coops, you can see that nice hinged articulation piece, which is sort of points to it as an assembly rather than as a single mass. Hen houses. So this is kind of fun because we got to play a little bit with the scalar issues, because when industrialized agricultural production has introduced scale at in a kind of massive, arrogant way, such that you have something like the folded type of coop here, which would house maybe 6 to 10 laying chickens, and that's opposed to, say, the hen house, which has the same sort of typological, kind of formal typological assignments, but its scale is 6-7 times what the folded coop would be. This is a gabled roof coop, and you can see the way in which here it starts to read more monolithically, I think partially a function in that case of these skids that it rests on, and the skids being part of an extension of the wall surface rather than, say, footings in the conventional maison domino, for example. And we see a logic in, this is the gable roof corn crib, so moving from coops to corn cribs. And this is kind of fun for me because the storage of grain versus the roosting of a place for a chicken seem like very different functional imperatives, and yet there we have a massing skin, ground, so forth, that are remarkably similar. And so, we can start to reassign the issues of functionality that would typically really haunt this kind of exercise. And if you can reassign those, then they start to play into that Ungerian notion that that its concepts are not fixed, that they're not natural or universal, but in fact a kind of artifice. Slant-sided corn cribs, shed roof corn cribs, which we started calling. We said if these were in the city, they'd call them slabs, but they're shed roof corn cribs. Tall granaries. And tall granaries with canopies. And here I just want to remind that, you know, if this starts to feel like, okay, Dora's gone in this really strange direction, that, you know, the Le Corbusier and Eric Mendelssohn's impressions of America these were the images that they cart back to Europe and really use, if you'll pardon, again, upon the seed germ of an avant-garde modernism that's based on for them, a functional concern, but also ultimately the desire to start to remove ornament and to start to treat massing according to, you know, strong geometries of, you know, cubes and cylinders and so forth. And so, you know, I mean, it's not just like, oh, I'm out, you know, looking at granaries and stuff. It's also very much a story of how architecture develops its sensibilities. So circular corn cribs are kind of great because they're actually the kind of grounded primitive for other granaries. And grain likes to be stored in circular silos because of displacement and air. You need some airflow for it, but you also need to be able to displace the grain so that more fills in, so that you don't have kind of uneven spots, because otherwise you get like wetness and mildew and so forth. And it also likes to be lifted off of the ground for that reason. But the granary is interesting to me also because, you know, it's not really there for a human function. And I think that, you know, I glossed over that 10th criteria, which is, you know, I'm at a school that seems very enamored right now with object-oriented ontology, which removes the human. There's a lot of post-humanist discourse in contemporary architecture. And when I start to think about this impulse toward the post-human, on one hand, it can get very virtual very fast, but on the other hand, there's a material necessity that is not necessarily predicated on the human experience, and the circular grain silo is hard to build. It's expensive, and but it's there, you know, kind of on behalf of what the grain wants. Here you see a little bit more of the kind of humanist intervention in terms of making a monitor for that roof. Here, this is a circular granary with a canopy. Then clustered granaries and silos, and this is again that leap into the huge industrialization that you see in the Mendelssohn and Le Corbusier. Linear grain silos, which are awesome for lots of different reasons, and I'm thinking that most of you would be like, what's she gonna do with that? And let me tell you, I'm not doing anything with them. I'm not going to turn this into some other architecture. I have no plan. If you want to do that, please be my guest. I'm not interested in doing any transformation. Instead, these are gambrel granaries. Instead, I'm interested in a much more what I would call categorical imperative. These are monitor type hen houses, much larger, octagon hen houses. I also did we did feeders, so because feeders also have that funny post-humanist impulse in them. One, they're shaped according to the industrialized process of feed and hay. Feed is kind of more like a liquid in terms of like little pellets that run down, that trickle, whereas hay is a brick or either a circle. It comes out of the baler in a kind of condensed piece. And so when you're transporting it, you don't want to have to disaggregate that piece. And so the mobile feeding stations, for example, and the cattle feeders, tend to receive a bale. They're shaped to receive a bale, or they're shaped to receive, I'll show you pellet feeders here in a second. And then the other side of their shaping and their kind of existence has to do with the head of a cow, because the cow's biological impulse is as a ruminant, meaning they like to stretch. And so this is why, like at the zoo, the giraffe, they have the really tall enclosure for the giraffe, because giraffes actually, they don't like to feed off of the ground. They like to stretch up. Well, cows are kind of the same way. They like to sort of stretch their necks out. And so this looks, kind of horrible to our view, this kind of bar feeder that we have. But for the cow, it's like, oh, it's kind of a comfort. They can kind of stretch their little head, or their big old head, or whatever the case may be, into that thing. And the same is true in the mineral feeders, because now you have this thing that's much more like a liquid. And these are great because these tend to be roto-molded. They're all, tend to be one shape with a base, and they turn with wind. So they're circular like this, so that they can catch the wind, and they can therefore avoid kind of windy rain and stay nice and dry. And so, pardon the slide, these are some ground variations of salt and sand silos, drive-through hopper silos, group drive-through silos, barrel silos, tension membrane silos, and so forth. We also did stables, we did water towers and hay barns, which have been especially gratifying because they have so many of these different cladding options and directions. Okay, so why bother? And I would say because typology now, this is my task. And to accomplish my task, I'm going to call on the ancients, which is what I want to do. First, I want to insist that typology was not in its beginning, nor necessarily now, the abstract mechanism of a rigid system, but that the cataloging rampant at the end of the Revolutionary era, stemming from the Diderot Encyclopédies and including the architectural typologies of Quatremer de Cancy, was just as invested in the permutations of character, for which there was no ideal type, as it was with the establishment of a universal type. We could probably divide the ontological impulse at this time accordingly. The mathematic one, for which an eidos is established, and which we see a bit more in the Durand example, versus the biologic, social, and cultural one, for which the barest form of a moral code of individuals or species might pervade. And I contrast here Durand with Lavater and say that, maybe a typology now could have a little bit more Lavater. And I don't think I'm alone in this. I show Christy Ballier's possible volumes. In a contemporary era, we are seeing both, once again, operating on the page. The typology is a referent to an original, a primitive, a universal, and/or abstract condition, and the typology is a possibility of physical permutations filled, embodied with characteristic, postural, accretive, and figural qualities. This is also in Clark's and in Jennifer Bonner's. Both of them are deeply invested in the possible figural qualities that can be drawn, and this is in distinction from the conformity that a typology would conventionally rely upon. Again, it's not that these are all the same things, or they all belong to the same category. Remember in like Sesame Street, like one of these things is not like the other, right? And there is this kind of duty that is placed on the subjective individual to choose difference from the body of the same things. This is not about that kind of sameness. Instead, they're capable of producing distinct variations within the type, such that now the type possesses an internal incoherence at the level of a formal allegiance, even if the sum total of that type cannot be defined. The second attribute of a new typology would be that of using a typology as a non-hierarchical heterogeneous space. So immediately before Kipnis, remember back at that before all of the barns and everything. I feel like I took you through a drive through the country. So immediately before Kipnis introduces his Unger-based criteria, he critiques collage. And he does so on the basis that collage catalogs, he says. It makes a roster. But the source of Kipnis's critique of cataloging that collage offered was that it was posited as a finite set, a closed enfranchisement of each difference that could occupy the space of the collage, and thus could never fulfill its theoretical cause for, in Kipnis's mind, it couldn't fulfill its theoretical cause for heterogeneity and difference beyond that purview. Instead of collage, he proposed graphs, and both words collage and graph, I think, are used differently now. And he says this within the mandate to this is him, Kipnis, to produce heterogeneity within an intensive cohesion rather than out of an extensive incoherence and contradiction. But if you look at like these encyclopedias before the disciplinary era, say, of the beginning of the 19th century, you see these kind of occupying the same page in this non-hierarchical, heterogeneous way. And I'm seeing it again among my contemporary colleagues, Kyle Miller's Elements, rethinking this kind of aggregation of parts and parts as part types, much like, I think much cannier than Koolhaas's Elements, which I think were probably too ontologically barricaded from each other. Or in P.V. Arelli and The City as a Project, and then this Hong Kong types from an issue, Precis, I think, from 2011. My third game, so kind of 1, 2, 3, my third sort of game toward typology or demanding typology is that I believe that a new typology would behave or could behave more like a collection than it does a complete and exhaustive ontology, and is therefore not abstracted from its very keen kind of eye toward history and the way in which we think about how we use history. So the will to collect is, I think, an outward symptom of a crisis of history. If you think in the beginning of the 19th century, Sohn's own drawing of the collection of his artifacts was contemporary absolutely to Heinrich Hubsch's essay, In What Style Shall We Build?, which similarly sounded the alarm that the mediums and the messages had been kind of dislocated from each other, and therefore had allowed for this kind of super collection or almost hoarding of these various objets. So in the 20 years or so following the French and American revolutions and the rise of the Napoleon, the world of Western consciousness fully shifted from feudalism to capitalism, and in order to make this shift, the meaning of the artifact began to dissipate from its preeminent status of the outward iconography of the god king, to an object, in this case, in Sohn's case, of more material and commodity culture. And then another shift happens again, say 100 years later, and that forward momentum is also being historically implicated, that these were particular temples, these were particular cars, but both belong to a kind of locating device, and in this case, Le Corbusier trying to relocate what is the medium and the message, what is the proper form for the message of modern architecture, for which the temple is not it, the car would be it. So at this, in this kind of third cause, or raison for the typology, is now a return to our friend Roberto Mangabeira Unger, because it's my hope that my little collection, even if they're presented, stupidly, are actually part of a larger stake. And that is this period of endless transformation, as cool and nifty as it was, can and should learn. and can and should gain disciplinary intelligence. One of the reasons why you probably don't remember or know Auger is in part because he left the party a little early, and this is a quote from him from 2006. Much of contemporary architecture plays out an almost predetermined agenda of the visual imagination. So, the commitment to rigid linear proportions and centrally organized space in Renaissance architecture gave way to the polycentric dynamism of the Baroque, although this proliferation of spaces and forms remained under the spell of an ideal of axial symmetry. Similarly, the modernist commitment to a generic regularity far more comprehensive than the Renaissance proportions has been followed by a turn to systematic irregularity. That's us now. A breaking up of basic symmetries and correspondences. The pendular swing between rigid order and studied disorder seems merely to have continued with ever wider sweeps. The willingness of contemporary architects to play a role in this pre-written script would weaken if only they saw it more clearly for what it is, which is a kind of the fighting words in 2006. And so, he writes this sort of desperate letter to Bill Saunders at the Harvard Design Magazine that never gets published, and so Auger publishes it on his own website. I'm not saying that he's the second coming. I think he's a nutcase. But this guy's listening. So this is a slide. So Bob Somel, and this is a slide from Bob Somel, like from a few days ago. And this is why I love my iPhone. I just figured out that it actually has a phone function because I use it so much as a camera. In his lecture, Can You See What I'm Saying? Which is not unlike his mentor's turn, in that Somel is similarly rejecting the large pendular sweep in favor of a greater disciplinarity. He sees the problem as one in which the words have become untethered from the forms in a free market way. And we use a lot of the same words to describe, for example, very different schema, and Bob shows this in his lecture. Or a lot of personal words to describe forms that should have more disciplinary coherence, right? Like, a kind of I like it, or it came from me somehow. And he says about this moment in his lecture, he says, quote, "Architecture isn't just a discipline, it's a discourse. And so it can't be just personal. You can't just kind of separate those two." And so the event of going and seeing Bob, a week ago, now followed by this, that I believe that the words expressed in the call for the Almost Familiar Forms event belong to what I would say now is a super current impulse toward the discourse of the discipline. That type and typology accompany leaps in sophistication of this kind of time consciousness after maybe the revolutionary period has become more of a daily fact of our field and our practice. And almost familiar forms for me is not so much that they are familiar to us ontologically or referentially, but the exciting thing would be that at least they would be familiar to each other. The notions, say, of the family or the species, each less and less associated, say, with the frame of the page and more associated with the expansive activity of the platform, and embrace those inherent kind of contradictions and the reduction of a need to act, therefore, as just a sort of disciplinary bodyguard, and really to start to enrich from the middle. And I love this kind of set of bullet point questions. What is the role of typology? And I just kind of was reading this and saying, this is the role of typology. So I don't think everyone should love Mayberry. I'm not here to say, be rural. But I do think that we could meditate on the possibility that Mayberry was ultimately, as the film critic Elvis Mitchell puts it, a nexus point between cultural moments. He doesn't say that about Mayberry. He actually describes the plot of every movie according to two basic storylines. A person goes on a journey, and a stranger comes to town. Mayberry is that locale in the show, and Andy is its sheriff. He's consistently negotiating the borders between the local knowledge of someone like Floyd the barber and the worldly knowledges of the from-town strangers. And through this interplay, new sensibilities are born, ones that infuse canniness with compassion, individualism with a reasoned moral center. And yes, at the heart, I am an epistemologist of architecture. I don't want to make a new barn. I want to track and study architectural knowledge. And just as a aside, this occurs to me often, often. And maybe it's kind of my hope. So with a groan, I think many of you can recall a time in the topological discourse of architecture in which we became enamored with the knot, or knots. And knots were supposed to be these kind of continuous, extensible, extruded, stacked, tangential, complex, singular geometry. But if you look into knot theory, which is topology now, you'll see that the rush is on to classify the knots of knottiness. And one of the reasons is because the tenfold knot has now been successfully mathematically modeled, and they no longer have to worry about the modeling problem that had pursued. So this is certainly one place where topology and typology are beginning to meet. And I'm thrilled by the kind of open-endedness of this chart. And if you look at tenfold knots at this time, you'll see that there's like a proliferation of all of these types of charts. This one from the Institute of Figuring in Los Angeles, which is where my son was a knot champion. So there's Jack J, and I'm really proud of him. Thank you.